introduce our first speaker, Dr. Charlie Starr. And Dr. Starr has spoken at previous Tolkien conferences here at Urbana Theological Seminary, but he is probably best known as the leading expert in the world on C.S. Lewis's handwriting. And when he's in the hallway, you are welcome to ask him questions about C.S. Lewis's handwriting, especially that letter F. The letter F is very interesting. He has published several books in a variety of genres that can be found in our store. One particularly interesting one is called The Faun's Bookshelf. It's all about myth, and I highly recommend it. And he has an essay coming out soon in a book called Tolkien and the Arts that will be coming out this fall from Square Halo Press. And he's particularly excited about it because that is the first essay that he will have published on Tolkien. Most of his publications so far have been about C.S. Lewis. And he's also he is an associate professor in English language. I am so sorry.
English and Humanities.
English and Humanities, thank you. At Alderson Broaddus University.
Yep.
I can't read my own handwriting, everyone. This is really funny. And he's also a visiting professor at Northwind Seminary's Doctorate in Romantic Theology department, where he teaches classes on Tolkien and Lewis. Dr. Starr will be talking right now on Tolkien and Lewis's friendship, so take it away.
Thank you. And what Melody didn't mention is that the forthcoming Tolkien book on Tolkien and the Arts is one that she edited, and will be getting much deserved credit for. Hi, folks. I'm Charlie Starr. We're going to be talking about Tolkien on Lewis and Lewis on Tolkien, looking at their friendship. And most of what I want to do is done in their own words. I hope you all can see the cool display of books behind me. That lovely set of shelves with those lovely books was set up by my lovely wife to make me look very, very good. Let's go ahead then and jump right into it though. And I want to begin then with a sensational truth statement on the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, and that is this: without Tolkien, Lewis might never have become a Christian. And then think of the books he would not have written, including the Chronicles of Narnia, had that been the case. And without Lewis, Tolkien would have never finished nor published The Lord of the Rings. Well, my talk is divided into 5 parts, starting with the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis. They both taught at Oxford University, though at different colleges there. Lewis describes their first encounter in a work-related meeting in 1926 thusly. He says, Tolkien managed to get the discussion round to the proposed English prelim. I had a talk with him afterwards. He is a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. Can't read Spencer because of the forms. Thinks the language is the real thing in the school. Thinks all literature is written for the amusement of men between 30 and 40. We ought to vote ourselves out of existence if we were honest. No harm in him. Only needs a smack or so. By 1927, Lewis had joined a Tolkien-led linguistic society, which he described as a little Icelandic club in Oxford called the Kolbitar, which means literally coal biters, i.e. an Icelandic word for old cronies who sit around the fire so close that they look as if they were biting the coals. We have so far read the Younger Edda and the Volsung saga. Next term, we shall read the Laxdale saga. And so they continued to read every ancient Icelandic text in the original language, at least until 1930. Lewis and Tolkien shared a love for Norse mythology. They took to meeting regularly. On December 3rd, 1929, Lewis wrote that, one week I was up till 2:30, talking to the Anglo-Saxon professor Tolkien, who came back with me to college from a society and sat discoursing of the gods and giants in Asgard for 3 hours, then departing in the wind and rain. Who could turn him out, for the fire was bright and the talk good. But it wasn't long before Lewis was the primary, if not singular, audience for Tolkien's Tales of Middle-earth. Tolkien, said Lewis to a friend, is the man I spoke of when we were last together, the author of the voluminous, unpublished metrical romances and of the maps companions to them, showing the mountains of Dread and Nargothrond, the city of the orcs. That Lewis took more than a passing interest in Tolkien's tales will be proved later. By 1931, said Lewis in a letter to his brother, it had become a regular custom that Tolkien should drop in on me of a Monday morning and drink a glass. This is one of the pleasantest spots in the week. Sometimes we talk English school politics, sometimes we criticize one another's poems, other days we drift into theology or the state of the nation, Rarely we fly no higher than bawdy and puns. Furthermore, though Lewis was an Anglican and Tolkien a Catholic, they often spoke of religion. Says Lewis, I have had a Catholic among my most intimate friends for many years, and a great deal of our conversation has been religious. When all is said about the divisions of Christendom, there remains, by God's mercy, an enormous common ground, and that is Lewis from 1934. Lewis wrote reviews for Tolkien of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Of the former, he said that it admits us to a world of its own, a world that seems to have been going on before we stumbled into it. Prediction is dangerous, he concluded, but The Hobbit may well prove a classic. And Lewis was a good predictor, wasn't he? Gems in Lewis's review of Lord of the Rings include, probably no book yet written in the world is quite such a radical instance of what its author has elsewhere called subcreation. And then also, the value of the myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores to them the rich significance which had been hidden by the veil of familiarity. As long as the story lingers in our minds, the real things are more themselves. The book applies the treatment to good and evil, to our endless perils, our anguish, and our joys. By dipping them in myth, we see them more clearly. A few notes before we turn to the other literary society Lewis and Tolkien participated in, the Inklings. But the most famous Inklings letter was ever written was offered to an American named Warfield Furor, probably butchered that name, who among others sent Lewis staples which could not be gotten after World War II in England for many years, including meat. Upon receiving a sizable canned ham from Furor, Lewis wrote back that its fate had been to provide a feast for the Inklings in March of 1948. 8 men gathered as much food as they could find, the centerpiece being Furor's ham, and Lewis wrote, all agreed that they hadn't eaten such a dinner for 5 years or more. Lewis signed the letter, yours amicably, and included a ham testimonial, which begins, the undersigned have just partaken of your ham, have drunk to your health. The letter is signed with lengthy accompanying titles by such Inklings as Lewis, his brother Warnie, David Cecil, Colin Hardy, Christopher Tolkien, and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien wrote of another ham feast provided by Furor in 1952, saying, it was like a glimpse of good times, a great success. Letters from their later years show the depth of their friendship, though also a distancing between Lewis and Tolkien. In 1958, Lewis shared an intimate note in a letter to Tolkien. Lewis's brother suffered as a binge alcoholic. Tolkien knew this, as is evident when Lewis wrote to him, Warnie, for the first time this many years, came back from his Irish holiday sober. Next, discovered only a decade ago, a letter by Lewis shows that when he was asked to nominate someone for the 1961 Nobel Prize for Literature, he offered Tolkien's name up as the candidate for The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote 2 significant letters just after Lewis's death, the first to his daughter, Priscilla. He says, so far I have felt the normal feelings of a man of my age. Like an old tree that is losing all its leaves one by one, this feels like an axe blow near the roots. Very sad that we should have been so separated in the last years, but our time of close communion endured in memory for both of us. And then to Michael Tolkien, Jack Lewis's death on the 22nd has preoccupied me. It is also involving me in some correspondence, as many people still regard me as one of his intimates. Alas, that ceased to be some 10 years ago. We were separated first by the sudden apparition of Charles Williams, and then by Lewis's marriage, of which he never even told me. I learned of it long after the event. But that was not Tolkien's last word on Lewis, and we will return to it at the end of this little discussion. Well, part 2 then of the talk is on the Inklings specifically. So the previously mentioned Second Oxford Club, to which Tolkien and Lewis belonged, was an unofficial group dubbed the Inklings. Tolkien once gave a history of this group's origin and activities. He says, I can give you a brief account of the name Inklings from memory. The name was not invented by CSL nor by me. In origin, it was an undergraduate chess devised by the name as the name of a literary writers club. The founder was an undergraduate named Tangeline. I probably butchered that name too. The date I do not remember, probably mid-30s. He asked some Dons to join. Both CSL and I became members. The club met in TL's rooms in University College. Its procedure was that at each meeting, members should read aloud unpublished compositions. These were supposed to be open to immediate criticism. The club soon died, but CSL and I at least survived. Its name was then transferred by CSL to the undetermined and unelected circle of friends who gathered about CSL and met in his rooms in Magdalen. Although our habit was to read aloud compositions of various kinds and lengths, this association and its habit would in fact have come into being at that time, whether the original short-lived club had never existed or not. CSL had a passion for hearing things read aloud, a power of memory for things received in that way, and also a facility in extempore criticism, none of which were shared, especially not the last, in anything like the same degree by his friends. Among the first fruits of this now most famousest of literary circles was Tolkien connecting Lewis to Stanley Unwin for the publication of Out of the Silent Planet. Tolkien wrote to Unwin, "Mr. C.S. Lewis tells me that you have allowed him to submit you Out of the Silent Planet. I read it, of course, and I have since heard it pass a rather different test, that of being read aloud to our local club, which goes in for reading things short and long out loud. It proved exciting serial and was highly approved, but of course we are all rather like-minded." When one of Unwin's readers suggested the book be rejected rather than published, Tolkien came to Lewis's defense and helped secure the book's release. I'll have more to say about how Out of the Silent Planet came into existence a little later on. Letters by Tolkien and Lewis both describe some of the Inklings' goings-on. Lewis, 1939. On Thursday, we had a meeting of the Inklings. I have never in my life seen Hugo Dyson so exuberant, a roaring cataract of nonsense. The bill of fare consisted of the new Hobbit book from Tolkien, a nativity play from Williams, and a chapter out of the book on the problem of pain from me. Lewis would go on to dedicate the problem of pain to the Inklings and the Screwtape letters to Tolkien. Here's Tolkien, 1941. I have had one amusement lately. Dr. Havard took me and the Lewis brothers out to a pub at Appleton on a snowy, skiddy night last Tuesday. JB had given me a little pot of snuff as a birthday present, so I brought it out of my pocket and read out the ancient label. As supplied to their majesties, the kings of Hanover and Belgium, etc., the Duke of Cumberland and the Duchess of Kent. Will anyone have any? I asked. Many homey hands of yokels were thrust out, and several cap-lifting explosions followed. Major Lewis, unaware that Blackwell lives in Appleton, and that the locals were all ears, gave an amusing account of visiting Blackwell's bookstore with Hugo Dyson. When he came to the point at which the assistant returned to Hugo and said, "Sorry, sir, we have no second-hand copy, but we have a new copy," and Hugo replied, "Well, rub it on the floor and make it second-hand. It's all the same to me," there was loud applause. Apart from this brief interlude, life has been rather dull. In more than half a dozen additional letters, Tolkien recounts Inklings' meetings, often noting the reading of chapters from Lord of the Rings to Lewis and Charles Williams. Tolkien notes that the Inklings were sometimes joined by guest celebrities, such as E.R. Edison and Roy Campbell, and that the only Inkling among the group who could tackle Lewis intellectually was Owen Barfield, who forced Lewis to define everything and interrupted Lewis's most dogmatic pronouncements with subtle distinguos. Of a night with Barfield in the meeting, Tolkien wrote, "The result was a most amusing and highly contentious evening on which, had an outsider eavesdropped, he would have thought it a meeting of fell enemies hurling deadly insults before drawing their guns." A little-known Tolkien fragment from the mid-40s makes some excellent fun of the Inklings. The Notion Club papers, as they're called, in Volume 9 of Christopher Tolkien's History of Middle-earth, Sauron Defeated, begins with the following title, "Beyond Lewis, or Out of the Talkative Planet." And it continues with, "Being a fragment of an apocryphal Inklings saga made by some imitator at some time in the 1980s. And again, Tolkien wrote that in the 40s. This is followed by a preface to the Inklings in which the company is begged not to look for their faces in the mirror, for the mirror is cracked. There was one instance in which Tolkien feared that he had hurt Lewis's feelings with too harsh a critique, as he wrote in a letter to Lewis of 1948. He says, "I have been possessed on occasions, few happily, with a sort of furor scribendi, in which the pen finds the words rather than head or heart, and this was one of them. But nothing in your speech or matter gave me any reason to suppose that you felt offended. Yet I could see that you felt. You would have been hardly human otherwise. And your letter shows how much. I dare say under grace that will do good rather than harm. But that is between you and God. It is one of the mysteries of pain that it is for the sufferer an opportunity for good, a path of ascent, however hard. But it remains an evil, and it must dismay any conscience to have caused it carelessly or in excess, let alone willfully. And even under necessity or privilege, as of a father or master in punishment, or even a man beating a dog, it is the rod of God only to be wielded with trepidation. There may have been one or two of my comments that were just or valid, but I should have limited myself to them and expressed them differently. He is a savage physician who coats a not wholly unpalatable pill with a covering of gall. But God bless you for your goodness. And instead of confessing as sinful the natural and inevitable feeling of pain and its reactions, do me the great generosity of making me a present of the pains I have caused, so that I may share in the good you have put them to. I do not know if I make myself clear, but I suppose that it is in our power as members of Christ to make such gifts effectively." The truth is, Lewis liked Tolkien's work more than Tolkien liked Lewis's work. Tolkien found fault even in his favorite of Lewis's books, Out of the Silent Planet. He thought it was too short. Tolkien's response to The Great Divorce was lukewarm, and he disliked The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe strongly. This, however, was not the reason Tolkien stopped attending Inklings meetings. The person probably most responsible for Tolkien's withdrawal from the gatherings was Hugo Dyson, who alienated Tolkien through a hatred of his readings from The Lord of the Rings at the evening meetings. Lewis wrote of Tolkien's absence in two letters. From 1958 to Tolkien, he wrote, "It is nice to see Christopher, Tolkien's son, again regularly on Monday mornings. It would be nicer still if he were accompanied by his aged P." And from 1959, "There is still a weekly meeting at the Bird and Baby, but whether you can call up the old group when there is a new landlord, and Charles Williams is dead, and Tolkien never comes, is almost a metaphysical question." Well, now we turn then to part 3 of the discussion, which is C.S. Lewis, reluctant convert, and we look at Tolkien's role in Lewis's conversion to Christianity. Now, as I said at the beginning, the most important impact of the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien is this. Without Tolkien, Lewis might never have become a Christian, and without Lewis, Tolkien would have never finished The Lord of the Rings. We take up Tolkien's role in Lewis's conversion here, and we'll look at the other thereafter. To a Catholic friend named Dom Bede Griffiths, Lewis once wrote, "Williams Dyson of Reading University and my brother, Anglicans, and Tolkien and my doctor, Havard, your church, are the Inklings to whom my problem of pain was dedicated. We meet on Friday evenings in my rooms, theoretically to talk about literature, but in fact nearly always to talk about something better. What I owe to them all is incalculable. Dyson and Tolkien were the immediate human causes of my own conversion." Dyson and Tolkien were the immediate human causes of my own conversion. Well, how did that happen? Lewis described the event of a September night in 1931 in a letter to his friend Arthur Greaves. He wrote that Hugo Dyson came to visit and stay in Lewis's rooms at college so they could talk far into the night. Tolkien joined them and didn't leave till 3 a.m. They went for a stroll nearby on Addison's Walk, and wrote Lewis, "We began on metaphor and myth, interrupted by a rush of wind which came so suddenly on the still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We all held our breath, the other two appreciating the ecstasy of such a thing almost as you would. We continued in my room on Christianity, a good, long, satisfying talk in which I learned a lot." A little over a week later, Lewis wrote back, I've just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ in Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long night with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. Lewis's explanation to his friend, and this is his friend here is Arthur Greaves, came 2.5 weeks later. He said, "What has been holding me back, at any rate for the last year or so, has not been so much a difficulty in believing as a difficulty in knowing what the doctrine meant. You can't believe a thing while you are ignorant what the thing is. My puzzle was the whole doctrine of redemption. In what sense the life and death of Christ saved or opened salvation to the world. What I couldn't see was how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was, 2,000 years ago could help us here and now, except insofar as his example helped us. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving God, Balder, Adonis, Bacchus, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with the tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths, i.e., the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. Therefore, it is true, not in the sense of being a description of God, that no finite mind could take in, but in the sense of being the way in which God chooses to or can appear to our faculties. The doctrines we get out of the true myth are, of course, less true, already expressed in a language more adequate, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. Now, the only other clues we get to the content of the conversion conversation, other than from these Lewis letters, are from a poem written by Tolkien called Mythopoeia. It's prefaced with the lines, "To one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver." So apparently Lewis said they were breathed, myth is lies breathed through silver. The general take among Tolkien and Lewis critics, first established in a book called The Inklings by Humphrey Carpenter, is that Tolkien had argued that myth is true, and Lewis, while he loved it, thought myth to have no connections to reality, to be therefore a lie, though a beautiful one. Tolkien argued, on the contrary, that myths were not lies. They were inventions about reality, just as words are inventions about objects in reality. Tolkien used among his examples trees and stars. Thus, in Mythopoeia, he wrote, "You look at trees and label them just so, yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been whose speech's involuted breath unfurled." Here, Tolkien makes the claim to words as inventions about objects in reality, about parts of reality. But he goes even further. He says, "He sees no stars who does not see them first of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth." So here Tolkien is arguing that the objects of reality have no meaning and are even unrecognizable to us until we invent myths to make them recognizable and understood. And Tolkien concludes that all of this is because we are sub-creators. We make myth because God is a creator and we are made in his image. In order to understand the world, we invent myths which, though they may be imperfect, nevertheless make the apprehension of truth about the world possible for us. What we can best conclude then is that Lewis had thought that myth had no truth value whatsoever. Tolkien taught him that it did. This allowed Lewis to realize that God spoke truth in numerous myths, especially of the dying and reviving God, in religions all over the world. This God did to prepare humanity for the myth become fact, for the one time in history when God would incarnate, live on earth, die, and rise again. In Christianity, Lewis's love for myth and his persistent pursuit of truth came together in the historical events of the life of Christ. But Lewis may have never made this connection without Tolkien, and for that we owe Tolkien a great deal of thanks. All right then, well, that's part 3. Let's move into part 4. I called part 3 of this discussion Lewis Reluctant Convert. I call part 4 Tolkien Reluctant Writer. Now, that anyone could refer to Tolkien as a reluctant writer seems impossible, but the tiniest bit of research into Tolkien as a writer reveals to us just how unlikely it is that we would have ever had anything from him if it hadn't been encouraged by C.S. Lewis. Let's begin with their collaborations, which were hit and miss, the miss always, frankly, being Tolkien's fault. Their first collaboration was not an intended one. At the end of 1929, Tolkien gave Lewis a poetic version of the tale of Beren and Luthien, which had many names, including the Lay of Leithian. This is currently available in Tolkien's Lays of Beleriand and in the recently released Beren and Luthien. One thing to keep in mind is that Tolkien had almost no readers for his Middle-earth tales at this time, and few still even till the publication of The Lord of the Rings in the mid-50s, excepting The Hobbit. Lewis was among his first readers, and at times one of perhaps only 2 or 3 for several decades of Tolkien's life. Lewis loved the tale of Beren and Luthien and wrote some 14 pages of criticism on the work, which he disguised in the form of a literary critic working with some ancient manuscript from some dark age. Thus, when Lewis suggested some rewrites of certain lines, he talked about the alternate, less corrupt version of the manuscript. Great fun there. Their next almost collaboration was in the form of writing a pair of science fiction tales. Tolkien wrote of it several times. He says, Lewis said to me one day, Tollers, there's too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves. We agreed that he should try space travel and I should try time travel. His result is well known. My effort, after a few promising chapters, ran dry. Or again, here's another Tolkien letter. As C.S. Lewis said to me long ago, more or less, if they won't write the kind of books we want to read, we shall have to write them ourselves. Being a man of immense power and industry, his trilogy was finished much sooner amidst much other work. The book which Tolkien never finished was called The Lost Road. The chapters Tolkien wrote have been published. It was going to involve a journey back to Numenor at the time of its fall in the Second Age of Middle-earth. Lewis, on the other hand, completed his space journey and published it as Out of the Silent Planet. 2 more books followed. However, one aspect of this collaboration credits Tolkien. Lewis could not at first find a publisher for Silent Planet, so Tolkien connected him to Stanley Unwin. Then, when one of Unwin's readers panned the book, Tolkien wrote back with a strong defense of the book, a strong attack on the reader's reasons for wanting to reject it. Out of the Silent Planet was published thanks to Tolkien's efforts, and therefore I think we could safely say that Perelandra and That Hideous Strength were written and published because the first book was able to be published. A rare successful collaboration between the friends was a book entitled Essays Presented to Charles Williams. Tolkien, Lewis, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams are considered the most important of the Inklings, the core group. Williams was among them for only 6 years or so before he suddenly died, but even before his death, Lewis and Tolkien had discussed gathering a series of essays together in honor of Williams. Even T.S. Eliot, who was a friend and admirer of Williams, was asked to contribute, though Eliot was too busy in the end to meet the deadline. Dorothy Sayers and Barfield contributed to the book, as did Lewis and Tolkien. Lewis was the editor. Tolkien's most important work of the mythopoeic theory is his On Fairy Stories. This lengthy essay began as a talk in the Andrew Lang Lectures at St. Andrews in 1938 and was expanded into the form published in the anthology. Essays Presented to Charles Williams was published in 1947, and again, we can probably give some credit to Lewis for seeing On Fairy Stories reach the light of day, especially an expanded version of On Fairy Stories. So that's wonderful. In 1944, Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher of several book ideas which he and Lewis were tossing about. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "We also begin to consider writing a book in collaboration on language, nature, origin, functions." By 1948, though, this book had even gotten so far as being called Language and Human Nature in an announcement of forthcoming books from the student Christian movement in Oxford, which expected it to be published in 1949. But by December 1st of 1950, Lewis would write, "My book with Professor Tolkien, any book in collaboration with that great but dilatory and unmethodical man, is dated, I fear, to appear on the Greek kalends," which is a phrase used by Emperor Augustus for never. The only result of this failed collaboration is a single, though wonderfully opening chapter by Lewis, which was discovered in the mid-2000s and published in the journal Seven. As we move from collaboration to annoying procrastination, the bottom line is this: Tolkien seldom finished what he started. As witness to this sad state of writing perfectionism, for which we can be both unhappy and thankful, Lewis once wrote a footnote which made Tolkien turn Lewis into a liar. Lewis's essay, The Alliterative Meter, first appeared in 1935 in a journal and then in his book Rehabilitations. The English alliterative meter is the meter of Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon. It involves the repetition of opening consonants or vowels, usually two or three times in a line. Its rhythm is drum-like. Lewis wrote a fanciful example for his essay. "We were talking of dragons, Tolkien and I, in a Berkshire bar. The big workman, who sat silent and sucked his pipe all the evening from his empty mug, with gleaming eye glanced towards us. I seen 'em myself," he said fiercely. The event is fictional, but in Lewis's opening paragraph, as he introduces the reader to the alliterative meter, he writes, "Professor Tolkien will soon, I hope, be ready to publish an alliterative poem." But though Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur would be published, it would be some 80 years later and only in an incomplete form. Oh, Tolkien, why make Lewis look so bad? Now, the rhythm of Tolkien's meter, by the way, is more forceful than Lewis's example and is worth a brief taste, and The Fall of Arthur is certainly worth reading. Here's Tolkien's. "Arthur eastward in arms purposed, his war to wage on wild marches, overseas sailing to Saxon lands, from the Roman realm ruin defending." And now we turn to what Tolkien first called the second Hobbit. And here again is the profound claim: without C.S. Lewis, Tolkien would have never finished it. As early as 1938, Tolkien wrote that his son Christopher and his friend Lewis were reading The Lord of the Rings in serial form. In 1944, Tolkien wrote, "I saw the two Lewis brothers yesterday and lunched with CSL. Quite an outing for me. The indefatigable man read me part of a new story. But he is putting the screw on me to finish mine. I needed some pressure and shall probably respond." 2 months later, he wrote again, "I worked very hard at my chapter, most exhausting work. I wrote and tore up and rewrote most of it a good many times. But I was rewarded this morning as both CSL, Lewis, and CW, Charles Williams, thought it an admirable performance, and the latest chapters the best so far." 10 days later, Tolkien read 2 chapters, Shelob's Lair and The Choices of Master Samwise, to Lewis on a Monday morning. Lewis approved with unusual fervor and was actually affected to tears by that chapter. The speed of Tolkien's progress in this year gave Lewis cause to hope, as he wrote in October of 44, that The Hobbit's successor will soon be finished. Lewis should have perhaps learned his lesson. 3 years later, he wrote, "Professor Tolkien's second Hobbit is still unfinished. He works like a coral insect, you know." Now, of course, we know Tolkien did finish the book, but the first full typescript of The Lord of the Rings was not completed until 1949. Lewis read the manuscript near the end of October and wrote his friend the kindest of congratulations, saying, "My dear Tollers, let us praise hobbits indeed. I have drained the rich cup and satisfied a long thirst. Once it really gets underway, the steady upward slope of grandeur and terror is almost unequaled in the whole range of narrative art known to me. In two virtues, I think it excels, sheer subcreation and gravitas. I am sure it is in itself a great and hard, bitter book which, though I love it, I shall never open without a certain shrinking. It will rank along with the Aeneid as one of what I call my immediately sub-religious books. I congratulate you. All the long years you have spent on it are justified." And then Lewis concluded, "I miss you very much." That was in 1949. In what way, then, was Lewis responsible for The Lord of the Rings? According to Lewis, certainly not by his critique of the book as it was being written. Twice he noted, and as for anyone influencing Tolkien, you might as well, to adapt The White King, try to influence a Bandersnatch. And again, no one ever influenced Tolkien. You might as well try to influence a Bandersnatch. We listened to his work, but could affect it only by encouragement. He has only two reactions to criticism. Either he begins the whole work over again from the beginning, or else takes no notice at all. Lewis concluded near the end of his life, "I don't think Tolkien influenced me, and I am certain I didn't influence him. That is, didn't influence what he wrote. My continual encouragement, carried to the point of nagging, influenced him very much to write it all with that gravity and at that length. In other words, I acted as a midwife, not as a father." And a week and a half later, "When you'll get any more in print from him, Tolkien, Lord knows. You see, he is both a procrastinator and a perfectionist. You have no idea with what laborious midwifery we got The Lord of the Rings out of him." Now, Tolkien gives Lewis a little more credit on the influence. And here's Tolkien. When he would say, "You can do better than that. Better, Tolkien, please," I would try. I'd sit down and write the section over and over. That happened with the confrontation between Gandalf and his rival wizard Saruman in the ravaged city of Isengard. That scene is one of the very few places where I found Lewis's detailed criticisms useful and just. And Tolkien gives ultimate credit to Lewis for his midwifery. I have never had much confidence in my own work, and even now, when I am assured that it has value for other people, I feel diffident, reluctant, as it were, to expose my world of imagination to possibly contemptuous eyes and ears. But for the encouragement of CSL, I do not think that I should have ever completed or offered for publication The Lord of the Rings. And as Alistair McGrath would say, well, there you have it. Finally, then, part 5 of my talk. I conclude with some notes that each man offered about the other. First, Lewis on Tolkien. In a letter of 1933, written to his then student George Sayer, Lewis wrote, "Tolkien is scholarly and he can be brilliant, though perhaps rather recondite for most undergraduates. But unfortunately, you may not be able to hear what he says. He is a bad lecturer. All the same, I advise you to go. If you do arrive early, sit near the front and pay particular attention to the extempore remarks and comments he often makes. These are usually the best things in the lecture. In fact, one could call him an inspired speaker of footnotes." To another aspiring young scholar, Charles Huttar, who at the age of 88 remains alive and active in the Lewis world, Lewis said of Tolkien, "He is the most unmanageable man in conversation I've ever met. He will talk to you all right, but the subject of his remarks will be whatever happens to be interesting him at the moment, which might be anything from Middle English words to Oxford politics. It will be only by luck if you get anything relevant to your own problems." To Tolkien himself on November 13, 1952, after hearing The Lord of the Rings was accepted for publication, Lewis wrote, "My dear Tollers, just a note to tell you with what agreeable warmth and weight your yesterday's good news lies on my mind. With an inward chuckle of deep content. Foremost, of course, is the sheer pleasure of looking forward to having the book to read and reread, but a lot of other things come in. So much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away quite spurless into the past is now in a sort made permanent. And I am, of course, very glad on your account too. I think the very prolonged pregnancy has drained a little vitality from you. There'll be a new ripeness and freedom when the book's out. God bless you. Finally, let's look at some notes from Tolkien about Lewis. Regarding The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Tolkien wrote to a friend, "It really won't do, you know. I mean to say, nymphs and their waves, the love life of a faun. Doesn't he know what he's talking about?" In 1954, Cambridge University decided to create a chair or professorship of medieval and Renaissance English. Though he taught at Oxford, Tolkien, as an expert in the field, was on the committee to elect the new chair. Tolkien thought the post would be perfect for Lewis, who had never been acknowledged at Oxford for his genius, having been turned down for a chair before. The job would be easier on Lewis and would triple his annual income. At first, Lewis didn't want to take the position because it meant working away from home through most of the week, nor was he interested in moving. Tolkien had to sit him down and talk him into it. And when we consider that Lewis tended to be the more outgoing and direct of the pair, and Tolkien the more reserved, even shy, that Tolkien would confront his friend in this way for his own good indicates an immense love and an incredible kindness. Shortly thereafter, Tolkien wrote to Cambridge, "Besides being the precise man for the job, Lewis would probably be happy there and actually be reinvigorated by a change of air. Oxford has not, I think, treated him very well. And though he is incapable of showing resentment, he has been a little dispirited. After our talk, he said he would accept." Well then, 2 notes from Tolkien after Lewis's death. First, CSL, of course, had some oddities and could sometimes be irritating. He was, after all, and remained an Irishman of Ulster. But he did nothing for effect. He was not a professional clown, but a natural one when a clown at all. He was generous-minded and on guard against all prejudices, though a few were too deep-rooted in his native background to be observed by him. I wish it could be forbidden that after a great man is dead, little men should scribble over him, who have not, and must know they have not, sufficient knowledge of his life and character to give them any key to the truth. And then to conclude our discussion, a note from a letter written by Tolkien just after Lewis's death in 1963. "We owed each a great debt to the other, and that tie with the deep affection that it begot remains. He was a great man, of whom the cold-blooded official obituaries only scraped the surface." And I thank you all. All right.
Thank you, Charlie. And we've got time for a couple of questions here. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and read them. And let's see here. So the first one is from, The first one is that wonderful apology quote on Paine's ministry available anywhere? It was so insightful.
Would you read that question again?
I'm so sorry. Is that wonderful apology quote on Paine's ministry available anywhere? It was so insightful.
Oh yeah, that's a letter written by Tolkien. And it's in the letters, Tolkien's 1-volume collected letters.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So here's another question, and it says, "Charlie, could you say more about Tolkien's alienation from the Inklings gatherings and Dyson?"
Yeah, the claim is made by, in the book Bandersnatch by Diana Glyer, that whenever there was going to be an Inklings meeting, Tolkien would bring a chapter and he would begin to read it, or he would have his son Christopher read it, because Christopher was a little more articulate, frankly, and could be understood more easily. But if Dyson showed up at a meeting, when Tolkien pulled out his chapter to read, Dyson would go, "Oh, not more about bloody hobbits," or something like that. So that Tolkien got to the point that if Dyson showed up, Tolkien just didn't even want to bother. He would have a chapter in his hand and he would just slip it quietly back in his pocket. And he stopped reading the Inklings, reading his chapters to the Inklings. Now, I don't know if that's the only cause, and I don't know if Diana Glyer would say it's the primary cause that Tolkien stopped coming to Inklings meetings, but it certainly is a factor. And I'm willing to bet it is the primary cause that that Tolkien just sort of drifted away from the meetings.
Excellent. Thank you. I have one other question here, and it says, will you be in the hallway during break or only over lunch?
I will certainly come in at the lunchtime, which I think is 1 p.m. Eastern. And then I will try to be in and out at other times through the day. I am not recovering from COVID right now, but I am recovering from my second COVID shot, which has really done a number on me. So I will have to be out as well as in throughout the rest of the day.